Well, I think maybe we should get started since we do have two talks today, and people will hopefully be continuing to join us as they can. So, welcome to the this week's edition of the Paleoglacier talks, and I'm going to start here with introducing Brenda Hall, who's going to be talking about the last termination in the Cordillera Darwin in Chile. So Brenda's a professor of glacial and quaternary geology at the University of Maine in the School of Earth and Climate Sciences and the Climate Change Institute. She is a former student of George Denton, who I believe is on the line with us today, and she's a glacial geomorphologist and geochronologist. And she uses cosmogenic isotopes, U-series dating, and radiocarbon. Her research focuses on the causes of ice ages and including especially their terminations, as well as on abrupt climate change. And Brenda's worked all over the world, but if you've read many of her papers, you might know that she's done quite a bit of work in Antarctica and South America. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Brenda.
All right. Well, thank you, Joe. Let's try the screen sharing. And okay, got that. Now let's see if I can put it in. Oops, okay. There. All right. Can you all see the presentation mode? All right, good. Well, thank you for the invitation to speak today, and thank you all for coming. I will actually, it seems a little strange. I won't be talking about the Western United States to this group, but instead we'll be talking about Western Chile, in particular Cordillera Darwin, which is located at the southernmost tip of South America. And one of the things I'm interested in is the cause of ice age terminations. Now, if we think about terminations, they're really the last, the biggest, the most recent, and the biggest global warming of the last 100,000 years. And one of the interesting things is that we still really do not understand their cause. Now, most of the traditional hypotheses tend to center around northern hemisphere, summer insolation, and so forth through orbital forcing. But those hypotheses just really don't work for the southern hemisphere, which experiences the opposite insolation. And so this leads to an interesting situation where global ice ages and their terminations are roughly globally synchronous, but where the supposed insulation forcing is really opposite in the two hemispheres. And this was noted by John Mercer in the 1970s, and it's what we now call Mercer's paradox. And so I'm interested in trying to understand, what drives the last termination in the Southern Hemisphere. And so this has led us to carry out work in the Southern Hemisphere, not just myself, but many people here at the University of Maine, including George Denton, who is on the meeting today, to try to figure out, what is it that drives Southern Hemisphere terminations. We approach this from a glacial geologic standpoint, and so we use glaciers as a way of tracking past climate change. And this particular project I'll be talking about today is in southernmost Chile in a place called Cordillera Darwin, which is really important, not only because it's the only landmass at this latitude, really, but also because it lies within the path of the southern westerly winds and it's adjacent to the Southern Ocean, both of which have been proposed to have some role in ice age terminations. And so I'll be talking about some of our recent work in Cordillera Darwin, and I want to emphasize this is not just my own work, but it is the result of a huge team of people, many of whom are listed there at the bottom of the screen. All right, so for those of you who aren't really familiar with this area, Cordillera Darwin is a east to west trending mountain range. Can you see my mouse? Anyone see my mouse? Okay, great. East-west trending mountain range in Tierra del Fuego. It's pretty close to Cape Horn, just south of the Straits of Magellan, and it lies in the path of the modern southern westerly winds. Today, the mountains support a relatively small ice field. And so these mountains are about 2,000 meters high, and there's an ice field there. There's also another one here called Clouet. These are the southernmost temperate ice fields in the world. At the last glacial maximum, this area had a much larger ice field, um, and that's shown by the yellow line on the screen. Um, the ice expanded out of the mountains and terminated in the west, somewhere on the continental shelf. This line is very much an artist's conception rather than based on real data. But it terminated somewhere out on the shelf down here, and then on land in Tierra del Fuego. It sent flow lines that went north up to the Straits of Magellan here in Bahia Inutil, and then southward and eastward out onto the shelf. And I just want to mention that sea level, of course, was a lot lower at this time, and so this ice sheet, although today it's surrounded by ocean, actually probably terminated on land for most of its extent. Much of this area remains unstudied. We don't actually know a lot about the past glacial history of this area. As an example, this LGM limit shown here is really well known around the Straits Magellan area and over in Tierra del Fuego, but the rest of this is virtually unknown. There are almost no data whatsoever that constrain its extent. And so this is an area where a little bit of research can produce a large amount of results because so little is actually known. So our project, see if I can, no, trying to move that, but our project involves superficial mapping as well as cosmogenic surface exposure dating to determine timing of ice recession and the formation of moraines. You can see, for example, some of these boulder moraines here, which are pretty neat. We also did coring to try to get basal ages, minimum limiting radiocarbon ages for deglaciation. So this area is very inaccessible. There are no roads, no settlements, no airstrips. It's the sort of place you really don't want to fly a helicopter because of the winds. And so really the only feasible way of getting around in this area is by boat. So this is the sailboat we used, a 70-foot sailboat. The beauty of something like this is that we can live on board, which is good in an area where the weather is quite stormy. And also it's shallow enough to get us in close to shore, which a larger boat would not be able to do. So all of our work in Cordillera Darwin has been by boat. So this is just a digital elevation model of the same region I showed before, with the LGM limit this time in red. To really get at the timing of the termination, we have taken two approaches. Most of our work is in the center of the ice field here to try to figure out when the ice collapsed back into the present-day glaciers. But the other part, which we have just started working on a little bit, is to try to figure out, what is the age out here, which is really at the margin, which would be the start of the termination. So how did it get from, let's say, here to here? What was the timing of that? How fast did that occur? And so I have less data to present today from out near the margin at two places called Grandi and Isla Whittlebury. We just have very preliminary early data. I'd actually hoped that we might have some data from the Livermore run that happened this last week. We've been waiting, as I imagine many of you have been, for about 6 months for the Livermore accelerator to come back up, and it just did. And so I was afraid maybe that last night I would get this huge data dump and I'd have to redraw all my figures. That didn't happen. But so anyway, we have preliminary data from out near the margins here, and then a lot more data from the center. So we'll start just with that out by the margins at Grandi. And so this is just a satellite image. You can see that Seno Grande is right here. There's another big fjord and a bay over here. These red lines are actually traces of moraines. And so they loop around over to here. This one you might be able to see under the red line because it crosses the fjord there. So we have a grand total of 2 exposure ages so far, and those are 18 and about 19 to 20,000 years before present. So actually this is well, it may only be 2 dates, but it's actually a major result because no one had known where the LGM position was along this margin before here. The ages of these moraines before had ranged from about 13,000 to maybe 35,000. And that was based really not on data, but on, well, mainly speculation and modeling, I would say. So we have the first dates here for the LGM in this location of roughly 18 to 20,000. There's also a radiocarbon age here, which is from a section um, where there's sort of a glacial marine diamicton with shells in it. And so as the ice advanced through the fjord to some of the moraines, it picked up the shells. And so this indicates that there are a couple ages here in this. This indicates that the advance to at least one of these moraines occurred after 23,000 years ago. And so this is just some of the first evidence for the LGM in this region. We have a very few data from Isla Whittlebury out on the western flank, and these are of erratics. And so this is looking at Isla Whittlebury and the present day ice here on Clouet. And so the glaciers would have come from the background right up over the island where we're standing and deposited erratics. And so far, we've got a few dates here, two populations between 20,000 and about 18,000 for the deposition of these erratics. So that's all the information there is for the LGM position, out along this margin. We also, though, have some good dates here for the innermost LGM moraine, both from work a student of ours did in the past and also work by Rob McCulloch. These are exposure ages of boulders on the innermost of the moraines in the LGM belt. So the general sort of impression, without a whole lot of data, is that the ice remained close to that LGM moraine belt until roughly a little, more than 18,000 years ago. Most of our work focuses in this central part of Cordillera Darwin, and just you can sort of see this triangular shape here where there's this divide here, which is this divide here. And so it's the Beagle Channel. And so that's the north arm and the south arm. And here we're really trying to get at when the ice got close to its present positions. And so one of the first sites we looked at is Pia here. And this is a beautiful fjord system right in the heart of the mountains. The crest is up here, Mount Darwin and so forth. The ridge lines are up here. And then the fjords come down through out to the Beagle Channel. You can see it's got amazing aerial scouring. All that bedrock has been stripped and it's molded. It's got all sorts of little ponds and bogs. It's just beautiful. You can also see this moraine here wraps around. And right here, that's really the only moraine you can see on this scale in Cordillera Darwin. It's actually Holocene in age. It's not even related to the termination. Our first work here is focused on this ridgeline here. And what we did was we wanted to reconstruct ice thinning history. And so we dated a number of erratics stepping down this bedrock ridge down towards the coast. And this is just what the area looks like. So there are lots of these big erratics sort of perched on the bedrock. There are also these bogs here, which we cored some of those. That's actually Tom Lowell for scale. Those of you who know Tom, right there. And then this is the close-up of that area. So you can see the scoured bedrock. There's that Holocene moraine that comes around. And then all of these ages are exposure ages, beryllium-10 exposure ages of erratics. And then these triangles are just locations where we have cores from bogs. So it doesn't actually show the age here, but it just shows the location. I'll say the ages from the bogs are slightly younger than the ages for the erratics, which is what you would expect since they're minimum ages for deglaciation and date when the vegetation comes in. So you can see, actually, just casually looking at this, that the ages at the top are more or less the same as the ages at the bottom of the hill. And if we look at it in a profile with elevation versus distance, and so the Beagle Channel is down here to the right, you can see that these ages are all pretty much the same. There's 17.2 at the top, and there's 17.1 at the bottom, um, which suggests to us this was a very rapid thinning event. And another way to look at that is using these tools from the ICE-T toolkit online. And these are modeling, the dates, the thinning history. And this is with internal errors. This is with external errors. And so if you take the full 2 sigma range from the 2 sigma error of the onset at the beginning to the same for the end. The full range gives you a thinning between 18.8 and 16.9. It probably was a lot quicker than that, but that's the full 2 sigma range with this model. The average age of all of those dates is about 17,700. And then just to mention this here, this yellow band, these are our radiocarbon, basal radiocarbon ages. And so again, they're just slightly younger than the exposure ages, which is what we would expect. And so our take home from this is that the thinning here was very rapid, really within our ability to resolve. I mean, our dating method just cannot resolve it any finer than this. Just some perspective on what that means as far as distance. So this is that site is right here in the center of Cordillera, Darwin. This is the proposed sort of LGM, inner LGM limit from the pad ice group. And so pad ice was a sort of a data synthesis modeling effort to reconstruct ice in Patagonia. And so this is their 20K limit, again, based on no information from this particular area. But our data from that Isla Whittleberry site are right here. And so these are the flow lines that would go by. So the flow was to the west through here. And so those would either come down through here. Some of them may have gone out through here. We don't know. No one knows at this point. But basically this results in a flow line that's either, something like 80 kilometers long if it's a direct flow, or if it goes out this way, it would be something like 120, 130 kilometers. Basically, what we're seeing is that the ice retreated from out near this LGM position back into the center of Cordillera Darwin, again, within that time frame that, within our ability to resolve it. I mean, basically between about 18 and 17 and a half or so, within a few hundred years to maybe 1,000 years. I want to also emphasize that we think that this retreat was largely driven by air temperature changes and surface melting and not by marine processes. And so while this area looks marine today, again, at the LGM, this would have been a largely terrestrial ice sheet. The shelf would have been exposed. And while there may be places where the ocean could poke back in a little bit, this was largely a terrestrial ice sheet. Okay, so that was over on the left side of the screen here. We also have worked in a valley about 10 kilometers to the east of that to try to look at what happened after that. What was the recession after that initial big pulse? And this is this is produced by my former student, Megan Spoth Asensao. And this is showing the recession of ice once it's separated from the Maine glacier in the Beagle Channel, which is this blue down below here. And it's separated and became its own, alpine glacier, essentially, which was retreating back up through this valley. And so I'll just walk you through this. You can see the bedrock here. So that's the same scoured bedrock with a radix that I just showed on the about 10 kilometers to the west of here. And it has the same sorts of ages. 17.7, these are all in gray. 17.7, 18.1, 18, 16.9, a little bit younger. But basically, this confirms that really early deglacial age. After that, though, the ice continued to retreat. but it started producing moraines about every 500 years or so. And so this outer moraine is in the mid 1700s. This is the light blue. The dark blue is one just a little bit inboard. This green is this middle one, so it's about 16.2 average age. This moraine inboard of that is about 15.8 average, and so forth, going up the hill essentially, um, until there was a big change during the Antarctic cold reversal, and that's what this purple unit is up here. The ice actually re-advanced during the Antarctic cold reversal. We only have it dated with two dates here. They're both around 13,000 years before present. And so take home from this slide is that early recession was, we have confirmation of that early recession at about 18,000. And then after that, it continued to retreat, but fluctuated as it retreated, with this, and then followed by an ACR readvance. And these are just the camel plots for that. All right. Moving on here, we wanted to look farther up flow line, and so we went to a place called Caleta Olla. And this is a view of that. And so this is all work that's still very much in progress, but this area has several glaciers. There's a big one over here called Hollanda, and then some smaller ones up here that came down this valley over here. Hollanda is now about 800 meters, and so this is about 800 meters from this large composite moraine complex, and this was last occupied in 1971, actually. But it contains all of the Holocene, all of the ridges for the Holocene within it. May also contain the Antarctic cold reversal, I don't know. But it's a large composite feature with multiple ridges. Outboard of that, we've got dates on bedrock here of erratics, and these are in the 15,000 year range, actually. A little bit younger, so 15.4. This light green one here is actually a radiocarbon age, and so that's a minimum limiting age from a bog, which is, again, consistent with the exposure ages. If we look over here to the west, there are a series of moraines, just shown here by dashed lines, the most prominent of which is the one associated with these yellow ages, and it's, again, the Antarctic cold reversal moraine, culminating about 13,100 years before present. Just outboard of that is another moraine that's about 16,000. 16,000. Similar to one of the moraines in the previous valley I just mentioned. And then outboard of that, there are erratics, which range up to as old as about 17,500. There's one 17, 16.4. There's a 15 that I think is probably an outlier. But basically, we're seeing the same sort of pattern we've seen farther west, with a fairly early deglaciation and then some moraines forming after that. I'm not going to have time to really go into detail about any of these other sites. I'll just briefly quickly just show slides from Penhaut and Fouquet. Those are both Antarctic cold reversal records. And so this is some work done by my student Sarah Thomas. A nice moraine set here from a glacier coming out of the fjord, 13,000 years before present. And then another site further west called Fouquet. You can see this beautiful moraine here coming out. That's a right lateral. The glacier's over here today. And again, that dates, well, the erratics outside it are about 15.3, but the moraine itself is 12,800. And so these are Antarctic cold reversal moraines. So just a summary. Sorry, I wish I could get rid of this, but it's not moving. This is just a summary of the results. We see this massive recession right at the start of the termination, shortly after 18,000 years ago. And within a few hundred years, certainly less than 1,000 years, the ice had gutted out the center of that ice field. Just for some uh, perspective, it was about 80% of the flow line was gone at that time. And it's not just the flow line that I've been talking about here, but there actually are a couple other flow lines where we have similar types of results. So very early, very fast recession at the start. This was followed by a brief pause with moraine building around 16,000 years ago, recession after that, and then a major, widespread at least, Antarctic cold reversal readvance. Okay, there we go. Um, so just as a sort of to summarize that on a map view, again, here's a proposed LGM limit out here. This is unfortunately under that bar, which I can't get to move, but that is 18,200 to 18,500 for the inner moraine there. Here we know that it was still at those moraines at 18.2 to 19.8, and here it was starting to become uncovered at 18.5 to perhaps 20. These two dates in yellow are minimum limiting carbon dates, which suggests the ice had already proceeded to the interior of the mountains here on the north side by almost 18,000, and same here on the south. And then the data I just showed in the interior suggests that the interior itself was gutted out almost by 18,000 years ago. So again, I'm just emphasizing that this retreat was very early and very fast and very big. Just as a very crude time distance diagram, this shows distance from the proposed LGM margin in the west. So these are the Isla Whittlebury data. These are the data around Pia. This is the data around Oya. And so very rapid recession, probably went behind the Antarctic cold reversal position and then a readvance, producing the ACR moraines. So just to wrap this up and summarize, we see nearly complete deglaciation of the sort of the LGM Cordillera Darwin ice field, within the first millennium, if not first few centuries of termination 1. There was a short pause at 16.2 and then a readvance. There may also have been submillennial pauses in the recession, but that's something we're still working on. The main takeaway, though, is that there was a very large, fast ice age termination in the southern hemisphere. And this is something that we're not finding just in Cordillera Darwin, but you could look up and down the Chilean Andes and find similar results. In the Lake District of Chile, for example, ice recession there was equally fast. In New Zealand, across the Pacific, same timing, same speed. And so the question then is, why was the ice age termination so big and so fast in the southern hemisphere at these latitudes? There have been a lot of things proposed to have caused the southern hemisphere termination over the years. Carbon dioxide, for example, in the atmosphere. We don't favor that interpretation in particular, in part because this is just too fast for carbon dioxide, which changes only something like 10 ppm over the time period we're looking at here. Our working hypothesis at the moment is that this is due to changes in the position of the southern westerly winds, and that this is due to a sudden southward jump in these westerly winds, which during the last glacial maximum, they would have occupied a position at about the latitude of the Chilean Lake District, roughly 40 degrees or so latitude. And at the start of the termination, we're suggesting that they made a rapid jump to about the latitude of Cordillera Darwin, or maybe even a little bit further south. And so this is at about 55 degrees south latitude. What that would do is the southern westerlies separate the warm subtropical air masses from the cold subpolar air masses. And so when those winds jump south, they migrate south even on annual bases, but when they move south, that suddenly puts a place like Cordillera Darwin in much warmer air masses than it would have been. And we would suggest that those warmer air masses are incompatible with what is actually a fairly low gradient ice sheet at the LGM, and that warming is what caused this rapid recession. So I'm probably over my time, so I'm going to stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. Thank you. Super, super interesting talk. Lots of great data. Um, we are maybe running a little long, but I think we probably have time for one question. If someone has a question for Brenda. Okay, I have a quick question for you, Brenda.
All right.
So I'm intrigued by the ACR presence here. It seems pretty robust, but I'm curious, what do you see in those moraines that distinguishes them as a readvance rather than just being a pause?
Right. So these are very distinct, prominent ridges that in many cases cross-cut some of the older moraines. And so it's really that cross-cutting. In addition, when you date things right outside the ACR, you don't, in many places, you don't get ages that are just slightly older than the ACR. You get ages that are 16,000 years old, for example. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I think that coupled with the continuous and very prominent nature of these moraines, which suggest a pretty active ice margin, suggests to me anyway that it's a readvance. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
I'll stop
Um,
sharing.
yeah,
And I
so
will
if anyone
bring that
has
up.
questions, more questions for Brenda, I'm sure you can ask her later or through the chat. But we're now going to get to our next talk here by Carrie Jennings. And Carrie is a research and policy director at at a Minnesota NGO, where she translates her understanding of the distribution of glacial sediment across the Great Lakes into policy and action to reduce surface water pollution and improve groundwater sustainability. She's an adjunct faculty at the University of Minnesota in Earth and Environmental Sciences and taught a field-oriented glacial geology course for 30 years, following in the footsteps of her PhD advisor, Herb Wright Jr. In her 24-year field geologist career at the Minnesota Geological Survey, she published 35 peer-reviewed articles, 28 maps, a lot of maps, and funded over $1.5 million in research. She completed her master's with Roger Hook in glaciology at the University of Minnesota. So I'm going to turn this over to you, Carrie.
Thank you very
And
much.
thank you.
Can you can see my screen and hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So this is older work. I've not been in the business for 10 years. I was surprised when Ben contacted me, but to date this work for you, I was inspired in my mapping when we started looking at Antarctica and understanding velocities of the ice streams and looking at ice streams as parts of catchment areas that were draining ice, especially in the West Antarctic. And later, others looked at the imprint of ice streams on the bed of the former Laurentide ice sheet, and you'll see compilations like this that Martin Margold did with others, Chris Stokes and Chris Clark. And this shows, kind of all the ice streams that are super obvious on the bed of the Laurentide, kind of all shown at the same time, not necessarily active at the same time. And I was looking at those here in the southern Laurentide, mostly the Des Moines lobe, but also some of these other lobes across the Great Lakes. And I see these lobes as the clear evidence of outlets of ice streams. And they're different because the outlets we have now are all marine terminating. And so these are a style of glaciation that we just didn't understand in the Midwest. Some of the other kind of Laurentide, Southern Laurentide wide efforts I participated in over the years was to compile all those lines in yellow for the MOCA, Meltwater Ocean Cryosphere atmosphere effort. That was a big modeling effort. They got all these mappers in the region to kind of compile the way the ice sheet retreated over time. And then get your shovel out because these dots are all holes that we dug across the state of Minnesota. Sometimes these were to do indicator mineral tracing, and we took these all the way back up to the ice centers into Manitoba and Ontario, Saskatchewan. And then I also worked with a consulting firm as a sub to rectify all of the legends of maps. It centered on that area, which is a nuclear power plant in Detroit. And they were looking for evidence of neotectonics in the Detroit area so they could expand this plant without concern about earthquakes. And so I had to look at a lot of different maps and legends and stratigraphic records and come up with a common unit. So I felt pretty expert, at least in a library way, in that region. And I'm from Ohio. So Minnesota is centered in the continent. We're not quite close to the geographic center, but we are centered enough to have received ice from the two major distribution centers in the Laurentide, from the Keewatin Center and also the Labrador. I'm sorry, yeah, I'm saying this wrong. I haven't talked about this for so long. From the ice centered over kind of east of Hudson Bay. So it's interesting in Minnesota because we get till that is very distinctly different depending on the bedrock type that comes with these ice flow directions. So if you look at kind of these compilations of Canada, you can see areas where there's crystalline rock and sedimentary rock. And of course, people over the years have speculated about how sedimentary rock beds affect the flow of glaciers and ice sheets. But what we have in Minnesota is a clear pattern of Cretaceous carbonate rocks, Paleozoic carbonate rocks up in the northwest part of the state, and then older Archean greenstone and granites in the northeast. So you can look at the tills in Minnesota, and I hope you can still figure out where Minnesota is on this map, but I'll point it out. We have this little elbow bend on the west side of our border that is essentially the boundary between North Dakota and South Dakota. The Minnesota River takes a sharp turn in Mankato. We have the Twin Cities here. Of course, you recognize Lake Superior, and our northern border is north of these upper and lower Great Lakes, Red Lakes. So if you look at tills coming from these different areas, they have distinct lithologies. The Riding Mountain provenance, as we call it, after Riding Mountain, a location um, in Canada, has mostly Cretaceous shale, the gray, and some carbonates, very few crystalline rocks. If you shift east a little bit into kind of a Lake Winnipeg area, you start to lose the shale and you pick up a lot more Paleozoic carbonates, and you're increasing in your crystalline rock fragments. If you go even farther east, you start to get mostly meta sedimentary rocks and granite greenstone complex. And then if you go a little farther east, you get into the North Shore volcanic group, which is a 1.1 billion year old rift. So you have basalt, and then you have the sediment, the Cambrian and older sediment, red sandstones that filled that rift. So very clear distinction in the tills. And the glacial geologists who have mapped in this area use these different lithologies to indicate the provenance of tills. And you'll see, I'll show you the thick stack of units in a minute. But let me first say that we do have a thick stack of till to understand in Minnesota. This is one of my favorite outcrops on the Yellow Medicine River. And the last glacial is just the upper few meters. And the rest of this, so that would be isotope stage 2 and 4 combined. And then the bottom of this we know is still magnetically normal based on the work of Martin Roy and René Berendrecht. And so we're looking at something above the Brunnes-Matayama reversal, so something younger than 770,000 years old, so probably stage 16 or younger. This outcrop was also studied with Greg Balco and John Stone. They came to this area when Greg was working on his cosmogenic burial dating methods, and his methodology also verified this general age. So we do have lots of the more recent larger glaciations, but we have older glaciations as well. They're just not as well preserved here. And you were looking at an outcrop. I'm using my cursor here to show you kind of in the center part of the state. And that's 100 to 200. I'm looking at the units. I think that's feet of glacial sediment. That's not our thickest glacial sediment. In fact, that's rather thin. So we have a lot thicker glacial sediment in this feature called the Prairie Coteau, which is a erosional remnant. And also in northern Minnesota. Michigan, of course, the Lower Peninsula wins for the thickest glacial sediment. But I'm showing you, the last 770,000 years of an incomplete record of 2.3 million years of glaciation. And we've tried over the years to piece together our stratigraphy. You were looking at this second column, the Minnesota River Valley stratigraphy with the stage 2-4 glaciation in green with the northwest provenance, and then stacks of older tills beneath that that primarily come from the north and northeast provenances. We can't connect the stratigraphy across the state. Terrestrial environments just aren't great for preserving complete records. That's why we have oceans. I'm just going into all of this so that you can understand kind of what it takes to start to parse out, use the lithology for other things. There was a long effort to formalize the nomenclature of the tills in Minnesota, and this required creating areas of type sections and the extensive units. And just to show you an example of the New Ulm Formation, which is the till of the Des Moines lobe, we have its extent here, and its extent is in gray, but you can see there's dashed lines within it. And that's because it became clear that there were subtle variations within the till sheet or till sheets deposited by the Des Moines lobe. And so if you're familiar with stratigraphic nomenclature, formations are recognized at the field level, and then things that take a little more understanding to nuance out are members. And so we have multiple till members in the New Ulm Formation or the Des Moines lobe till, and I'm showing you an outcrop that has three. And I think you can probably see the boundary between two of the members because there's a little bit of sorted sediment that may be some kind of a proglacial fluvial sediment. But the next one is a vague contact that is marked by just a striated boulder. But if you take these till samples back to the lab, you can distinguish them. And so we have three members of the New Ulm Formation at this outcrop. And what I'm going to show you is that actually there's on this map 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 distinct members of the New Ulm Formation. And this is where you start thinking, why are we seeing distinct members of till that are layered and shingled like on top of one another? The way these distinctions are being made, by the way, is by detailed look at the sand, silt, and clay ratio. This is kind of what soil scientists do. They plot them on triangular diagrams. So this form falls in a clay loam to loam category. And then also looking at the counting sand grains, actually 1 to 2 millimeter sand grains, and separating them out into their lithologies of crystalline, shale, or carbonate. And these are distinctions unique to Minnesota. They make sense with our ice source area lithology. So it actually, if you normalize the percent sand against the percent shale, you start to get clusters that are really interesting to compare. And I'm showing you just all the dots on this last formation, the Heiberg member of the New Ulm Formation, to show you that not only is it distinct in its distribution, it also is uh, unique across the length of Minnesota. We have a till sheet that is lithologically similar across that length, which is, 200 miles or more. So, and now I also wish I could make this bar go away, but Brenda, just to assure you that it doesn't show up for them. So this, the provenance, so I think you can use this detailed look at the till to understand the evolution of the ice source area. And I'm going to call this the ice catchment. I used to call it the ice shed. People don't like ice shed, but kind of like watershed. So what we can see in these tills is that the provenance changes over time, sometimes without retreat of the ice. To me, that means there's some reorganization happening up in the ice catchment area. I can show this in the Michigan lobe, in the Rainy lobe, and also the Des Moines lobe, and I'll give you some examples. In some cases, you also see the lobe differentiating into multiple ice stream sources. So I think glacial geologists in the Midwest sometimes think that ice lobes can do anything like cross over one another and go around things. But what usually happens is they start to split. And I think it's because there's discrete tributaries forming in the ice catchment area that make it more lobate. I see this in the Rainy Superior and Brainy lobes in Minnesota and the Des Moines lobe in Minnesota. And then in some cases, the ice catchment area completely reorganizes and another lobe occupies the same area of a lobe that just retreated, but it has a completely different till provenance, sometimes 270 degrees oriented differently. So I see that in the Des Moines and Red River lobes, and also Michigan lobe and the Huron and Erie or the Erie Ontario lobes. And I think you can see that sometimes when glacial geologists can't tell really what's happening, they start to just hyphenate lobe names and smash them all together. So the Michigan lobe is an interesting one. And I think it's very well studied, and they were the first to have lithostratigraphic nomenclature. Ardith Hansel and Hilt Johnson worked a lot in this part of Illinois. And so they have this Michigan lobe that comes down to basically the Champaign-Urbana area, and they have these different till formations. But in 1986, they worked with Betty Saha, who was also a glaciologist, and were able to show with detailed sedimentologic studies that there were three diamictons that had lithologic breaks, but they did not have any ice retreat. And so they were ascribing this to various erosional, depositional, and glaciotectonic processes at the base of the ice sheet and changes in the source of sediment during a single glacial event. So if you've ever been there, this is a very old picture of the Wedren quarry, the red Wedren group diamicton. And so they reinterpreted this as deposition by active ice during one advance and recorded evidence for changes in source of the sediment and the basal ice sheet processes during a single advance and retreat. I would refer you to their publications for this detail, but basically Michigan lobe sits where it was and different till comes in while it's sitting basically in place. Um, Later, I'm kind of giving these in time order. Howard Morris and J.D. Lair called for the shift of a major divide in the Laurentide over Quebec that caused sometimes a distinct rock type called an Omarluck or Omar Formation rock to come into Minnesota, and other times it didn't. They linked this to drawdown of ice through the Hudson Strait. It was kind of trendy at the time to look for Omars and to talk about Heinrich events, and that's when this came about. And now I'm showing you these distinct till clusters of the Des Moines lobe, the New Ulm Formation. And we get a little crazy counting sand in Minnesota. I'm thankful I don't do it anymore. But you can see all of these distinct clusters of till that correspond to distinct layers and aerial extents of till sheets. So this lobe, as opposed to an orderly retreat, it seems to have pulses of at least till, maybe till with ice coming out of its source area in the Laurentide. Lobes differentiating into two distinct source areas over time. Think of something like it's kind of the opposite of the way a medial moraine forms, actually, now that I look at this. This is on the Juneau ice field. What we have is dating back to the first mapping, by Herb Wright, my advisor, um, lobes that looked confluent, and here I'm pointing to the Brainerd and superior lobes here at the St. Croix moraine that over time differentiated into separate lobes. They split apart. They show these little kind of seams forming in these lobes. There's evidence for reentrance forming and for glaciofluvial or lake sediment to be deposited. So what would cause that if those were, and I think the other evidence here is that drumlins that superimpose one another show reorientation of ice flow in that area. Um, Here it's very clear when those lobes differentiate. The source till, the source area of the superior lobe gives you this very red till. So here's another look at this later done by, I think, Mark Johnson and Howard Morris. Yeah, so we have this confluent ice margin at the St. Croix. These are just moraines remnants that then distinguish themselves into two different lobes as they during retreat. And then finally, this is the Minnesota River Basin, that elbow bend or the bend in the Minnesota River here at Mankato. And once we started getting really high resolution elevation terrain, we realized, or topography, we realized something was going on even within the Des Moines lobe. We have margins that go across part of the Minnesota River Valley, but are truncated at this feature. And then we have more margins up here. So even the Des Moines lobe, which looks kind of well behaved, at least it used to look well behaved, seems to have two separate ice stream sources. And in fact, this area this low relief ridge right here is actually marked by sand and gravel pockets and looks to be an ice surface low that might represent a shear margin. And we also can see from this detailed lithology that this shear margin or this ice lobe invaded the area of the other one as it retreated over time. So if you start to think about the source area in Manitoba and why this might be the case, it's easy to imagine scenarios where you have ice stream tributaries coming from any of these flow zones. And I think you can probably resolve some of the late flow lines around these bedrock uplands. These are, in fact, bedrock uplands in Manitoba. They're not in Minnesota. This is Turtle Mountains, for example, right here. And you can think that, well, perhaps these tributaries changed in their dominance over time, and that might be the reason for changes in lithology. I want to point out one other area over here because we know that there has some very high arsenic bedrock layers exposed on the east side of these bedrock uplands, and we can see that arsenic imprint in our tills. In other cases, it looks like the ice catchment area has completely reorganized. And I think of this with respect to the work that was done by mappers in with the Canadian Geological Survey and others. I'll show pictures of them in a moment. But the early flow in this part of the Laurentide ice sheet that didn't get very far into Montana and the Dakotas was actually directed towards the margin. And then later, what they call the Buffalo Corridor evolved. And I think of this when I look at the ice streams that I used to call A, B, C, D, and E. And C here was completely captured by ice stream B. So we have a case there where the ice streams reorganized just internally from dynamics. So Roberta Adams, along with Janet Campbell and Martin Ross, worked in this part of Canada, and the early advances of the Masqua ice stream were oriented towards Montana. And then later, this Buffalo Corridor worked its way headward into those uplands I just showed you in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and instead diverted all of the ice down into the Dakotas and into Minnesota. So this is complete reorganization over a 5,000 year period. So here's what they show for late glacial flow, or the glacial maximum, I would argue with their James Lobe interpretation here. And then the evolution of this corridor that's evolving those lows in Saskatchewan. And the last point I want to make about this area, based on the compilation I did and some other work, is that the final advance into this trough that was created by the Des Moines lobe, the Des Moines lobe we know retreated, you can see its retreat positions, retreated across here. It's bringing in rocks from Saskatchewan into Minnesota. But the final advance into this area was from straight north. So this little margin right here, people often equate with an advance of the Des Moines lobe, is an advance from a completely different ice center. And here's the moraine of the Red River lobe that I was just pointing to. And you can see it clearly retreats straight up into Lake Winnipeg, basically. So the Des Moines lobe has a source, till source coming from the northwest. The Red River lobe has a source from the north, and it has all that arsenic in it as well. Another example of complete reorganization of ice happened in the Lake Erie area. I happen to have this photo when we were working with the people that were looking at the neotectonics for the nuclear power plant. We helicoptered into quarries, which was kind of, I don't know, illegal, it seemed, but got some great photos of till over bedrock in that area. And what I'm going to show you next is a series of text coming from the compilation that I did that talks about the ice flow direction, ice flow originally coming from the north and then eventually down the axis of the Lake Erie Basin. And this is clear to them from heavy minerals in the till. So here we have the western Lake Erie Basin, actually the Lake Erie Islands, the Sandusky Peninsula. The lake kind of ends in this general area. These are beautiful moraines of the Erie lobe. So the boundary between the Ontario lobe and the Erie lobe and the more westerly Huron Erie lobe was considered to be in the central part of Lake Erie Basin, so off this slide a bit during the early part of the late Wisconsin glaciation, until deposited at this time was derived from sources straight north. And then the boundary was relocated to those islands I pointed out, 150 kilometer difference, right? These islands here. And then finally, the till sources were to the northeast and supported by the provenance of clasts and heavy mineral assemblages, and ice flowed down the axis. So this was a shift of 90 degrees in ice flow orientation. I've talked to some Canadians who also talk about ice actually completely reversing direction farther east. And then finally, ice reoccupying a basin that has a different source. I think this could be the case for the very famous late advance of the Michigan lobe, if we want to call it the Michigan lobe. But there, you might know this late advance because it sheared off a forest, a mature forest on the Door Peninsula, um, and the Two Creek forest bed is kind of a well-dated horizon there. But this till is completely different than the till of everything farther south. It's red and clayey. People have argued that it's because the ice retreated into the Lake Superior Basin, but I think it's also a reorientation of flow. So this late phase, this Two Rivers phase that also got into the lower peninsula of Michigan is distinctly different from these earlier advances of the Michigan lobe, which probably came from northeast. So there are other examples, I'm sure. I don't know all of them as well, but I think there's other reasons to try to unravel this ice stream compilation, understand the different phases of activity, and potentially coordinate with people who have mapped to understand it. Because I think there are some remaining questions. And the questions that I have are, how do we explain these changes over time? Um, I think if you have rivers and watersheds as an analog, and you can look at West Antarctica compared to East Antarctica, you can imagine that there is a headward migration of these ice streams into the ice source area, and that is going to be tapping new tills at the bed of the ice. You also have, as ice catchment areas mature, smaller and smaller tributaries evolving over time that are delivering more sediment to the discharge areas, the lobes or the ice shelves in this area. And then you have, in that case of ice streams C and B, or Willans, and I don't know if does C have a name, the complete capture of an ice shed. And so I could imagine this happening maybe as Thwaites continues to work its way up into the West Antarctica and capture something going into one of the other ice catchment areas. Or as I think it's good to watch what's happening in East Antarctica, and as these ice streams evolve, I would expect them to start looking a lot more like the West. The other questions I still have are, where is till made? Because if it is the same for 200 miles across Minnesota, it's just being conveyed across Minnesota. This is a big shear zone that's just taking it all with it, or it's frozen into the ice. So it must be all made in the ice stream catchment areas and then just conveyed across Minnesota. We do, I'll have to say, see some local incorporation, usually in looks a little brittle in the way it's incorporated, like some kind of tectonic incorporation or shearing in of materials. So some local, but the bulk of the till sheet is uniform for hundreds of miles. And then what would till fluxes and ice fluxes have to be for me to be seeing these changes in the lobe over time? And I looked at this table of sediment fluxes. I can't remember, I can't read the name of the author anymore, but I haven't tried to rectify these and decide if these till fluxes and ice fluxes make sense with getting something from the ice, from the lithologic source area in the ice catchment area all the way down to the margin of the lobe. So that's what I have to say. I feel like those are lots of unanswered questions. Quaternary geologists will continue, hopefully, to document the source of the material. They may show details of flow lines over time on their maps. But my experience in the Midwest is they still equate periods of ice advance with cold periods. And what I'm saying here means ice advances are evidence of ice sheet drawdown, and I don't equate them necessarily with cold periods, in not all cases. Um, and they'll continue to publish their observations and maps, which you probably won't see unless you try really hard to do literature searches that include maps. And they often don't separate their interpretations and their observations. Paleoglaciologist, that's a new word for me. That wasn't a thing when I was in grad school, but I think you can see ice catchment evolution over time. You certainly see major ice divide movement over time, and I wonder if we still have to talk about domes because I think it's more about divides than domes. And then I think you can help me and others understand that ice advance may mean ice sheet drawdown and help with the sediment fluxes and response time. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Carrie. Wow, that was super cool. So we're at 5:01, but if people have time, let's if anyone has questions for Carrie, go ahead.
Carrie,
Yes.
I've got one for you from Iowa. Um, what is up? I'm up here. I'm in northern Iowa,
Okay.
so I've always been cut off from the folks down south in the DNR. I've always sort of found out things secondhand. But we did some work on the Sheldon Creek
Yep.
earlier on, which really hasn't been worked on much, I don't think. How does that, um, how does what's going on in what we call the Sheldon Creek, sync up with what you were talking about in terms of the Des Moines lobes, changes over time?
It's one of our earliest phases. It's broader and less extensive to the south, and I think it's well dated. I think Art Bettis and others got some dates on wood in it, and
Yeah,
um, it's
that's
like
what I was relating to.
yeah, it's like an early phase. It's like a first phase of advance of that lobe from the northwest, and then everything else that came down was a little narrower and did get farther south, down to Des Moines. Yeah.
But so it basically occupied exactly the same footprint,
Not
almost.
exactly. It didn't get as far
Well,
south and it was fatter. It was
okay,
wider
yeah,
on
a little
either
bit.
side. And
But
I
there were,
think,
but there were two let me call them advances. We got ages of 46 or something like that, and then 26 on some of those trees that were buried there.
yeah. And
Is
I think you might have the answer to why we consider stage two and stage four one glaciation in the Midwest, because we don't see a clear interglacial period between that. In Iowa, you do have these two phases of advance, but up in Minnesota, it's just ice was here for stage two and four. So,
I see.
you know,
Okay, thanks.
Okay, anybody else? If you have time,
Keith,
just
Keith's sitting on
Keith.
the edge of the Des Moines lobe. You got to unmute though. Wait, you got to unmute, Keith.
Yeah.
There
You
you
got
go.
it.
So why am I sitting on the, yes, of course.
You're in Morris.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things, of course, Ben Lobbs and I were trying to get a whole series of cosmogenic ages from the boulders. And
Hmm.
when his department met its demise, that ended that project.
Were
So,
you doing that in Minnesota?
yeah,
Okay.
we have stuff around Big Stone and
Okay.
some other
Yeah.
places.
He mentioned that, and we had problems with that. So Greg did the burial dating, and that worked well. Paul Bierman was here first, and we were doing exposure dating on the Sioux Quartzite in beyond the Bemis Moraine, beyond the moraine of the Des Moines Lobe.
Yeah.
Got good exposure ages there for like it looked like stage 16 probably glaciation there. Um, and then we worked in the Minnesota River Valley as well. It was problematic at first because it was high aluminum in the rocks, and so the paired nuclide approach did not work well. He just kind of scrapped that and left it for a long time. And then I started looking at those rocks in there, and I don't think they were exposed until River Warren ripped through the floods of Glacial Lake Agassiz. And what you're looking at, unless they're exotic rocks, they are core stones that were re exposed when the saprolite was washed away from the Minnesota River granites and gneisses. So they aren't glacial erratics, they aren't glacial boulders, they are core stones that are essentially in place. So you have to be careful what you date out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But we had some very strange ages up the local ski area, Andy's Tower. Um, we sampled there and we've got ages all over the map.
Yeah.
But one that was interesting was maybe around 30. And, there was a suggestion that that moraine was overridden by the Des Moines lobe. So that older age may represent earlier deposition, sort of the core of the moraine.
Yeah. It could
But
very,
one age, the
yeah.
rest
Well,
were really strange.
and so we're getting all nerdy about Minnesota landscapes, but there's a little area, a little triangle of area in the middle of the state in the Wadena Drumlin Field that has ice wedge casts, lusk blown into them, ventifacts, but it looks like a lake glacial landscape. And that's probably, and the Wadena lobe Wadena lobed hills are probably stage 4 glaciation. So if you think about that, where that is with respect to where your boulder is, you might be looking at that. So sorry, this gets a little into the weeds here for those who are in the mountains or on the coast.
No, I think that's okay. We probably should wrap it up. I was just going to
Yeah, I
make one
gotta go.
comment though, which was
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith.
this was great and took me back to my early days working on the Laurentide. I was calling them cryohydrologic basins, which never stuck. So I think ice sheds is better. Anyways,
I think I settled on ice catchment area. So
yeah. Well, thank you again, Brenda and Carrie, for giving great talks this week. And of course, this is recorded, so we'll post it up onto our website if people can watch it later. So
I was honored to
thank
be
you all.
invited. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Yep.
Bye.
See y'all soon.